Well, General Secretaries don't get quite the time for reading and reflection that perhaps academics do, although it didn't particularly feel like it when I was here teaching, but nonetheless you realise that there are some benefits to the cycle of the academic year that don't quite arise with the cycle of the church year. And therefore this paper is perhaps not the kind of paper that once upon a time I might have delivered myself off, and I will have to beg your forgiveness for that. I'm going to attempt to respond to some of what we've heard in the past few days and do a little bit of looking forward. In one part of what I say, I do want to reflect a little bit on the history of one aspect of our life which I sense becomes increasingly significant and that we haven't touched upon very much, although many of you might well have done and will be perfectly capable of doing so. And that's the implications of some of the decisions that were taken about legal matters at the time the United Reformed Church came into being. I sense that some of the decisions taken, or perhaps not taken, some of the things that just happened, about the ways in which the United Reformed Church came to hold its property and its financial resources, which had been held in very different ways by the predecessor denominations, coupled with the very significant shift that there has been in questions around charity governance in the last 50 years, and compliance matters, has had a very significant impact on where we find ourselves today. This is a very practical impact of some of the questions that we have been exploring around our polity, ecclesiology, and theology. And I do want to start, before I get to some of those, with one or two reflections on those things. I remain, like Fleur, a significant fan of the basis of union. It opens with a rather extraordinary ecclesiological and ecumenical reflection on the Church and the United Reformed Church, followed by a reflection on the purpose of the Church, before articulating the faith the United Reformed Church upholds, and concluding with reflections on ministry. Manages to articulate an ecclesiology which is in its way profoundly Catholic and Reformed. It articulates with a contemporary voice the Niceno-Constantinopolitan faith. In fact, it does so now twice, once in the later version of inclusive language, and I too was at the debate. That was one of my formative moments as a young person in the life of the church, watching David and Leslie Newbingham battle this one out on the floor of assembly. But I believe it's a superb example of the Reformed tendency to restate the faith alive and new under the authority of the Word of God, inspired by the Holy Spirit in every generation. The basis of union as a whole clearly reflects the ecumenical movement of its time. That statement Michael read to us on the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, in that we find a superbly crafted articulation of what could be a common articulation of the faith of the vast majority of the life of the Church Catholic, rooted in a clear ecumenical convergence on the understanding of the Eucharist that was emerging at the same time the United Reformed Church emerged. There is very little the Roman Catholic theologian could not assent to in it, and relatively little they might feel they need to add. If the Protestant Reformations have a tendency to one of the classical heresies, it would be that of docetism, a tendency not to take the physical bodiliness of Christ and the implications of that seriously enough for our engagement with the physical world. We have noted a tendency to perhaps undervalue sacraments a little. Ecclesiologically, we perhaps do not take the full structural visibility of the Church seriously enough. And this, I think, we do see the basis of union, it articulates a wonderfully disembodied vision of the church. The basis itself says nothing whatsoever of the form, shape, or polity of the church. The polity is very clearly set out in the structure of the United Reformed Church, but the ecclesiological content of our statements of faith in no way offers a theological rationale for the polity that is unfolded. This is perhaps not entirely unusual. In many traditions, it feels a little like ecclesiology is worked out theologically and polity asserted. So nowhere do we confess that we believe the church to be intrinsically conciliar, or offer a theological rationale or reflection upon that. And whilst the shape of the church would tend in the Reformation traditions to be a secondary matter, it's not of the essay of the church. The basis of union, including its rich ecclesiological vision, could be worked out in almost any particular form of polity. There is nothing in the basis which suggests we could not be episcopal, and indeed, had any of the various proposals for bishops that we've approved over the years in the General Assembly come to pass, nothing in the basis of union would need to have changed. Whilst the failure of programmes for organic union, so presupposed by so many to be the natural next step at the formation of the URC, have complex and rich reasons why they didn't come to be or take visible form in the life of the church, I do wonder whether there are things there that we might learn about our own ecumenical engagement. It's very easy just to blame the Church of England, isn't it? And yet, what do we have to learn? There was a charge levelled at us a good number of years ago now in the trilateral conversations with the Church of England and the Methodist Church. I remember there being outrage at our ecumenical commitment being questioned. And yet, I always tended to the view that possibly the point was well made. It was about whether we truly are committed to visible unity, and what do we consider essential, if anything, in the visible shape and form of life in the church. Ministry is one thing we perhaps consider essential, which for us we find in the basis of union, the ministry of word and sacrament, the ministry of eldership, and the ministry of church-related community work. Two of those are ordained. One of those we're never quite sure if it should be ordained or not, but have always retained the ordination when we've asked the question. The third is commissioned, and interestingly could well form an ordained permanent diaconate, not entirely dissimilar to the Methodist diaconate, which could be an interesting ecumenical step forward to take. Polity was perhaps not a first-order issue for any of our predecessor traditions. The reflections Jean shared with us from an ethnographic perspective suggest that polity was pretty central to the self-identity of those within our predecessor traditions and embodied in their practices and ways of life. Inheriting what we were invited to consider as a named tradition for the Presbyterians or a re-tradition for the Congregationalists is closely related to their particular polities. And Romilly drew out for us clearly the very fundamental incommensurability of the two initial polities. And it's very clear that many of the issues created by that lovely grey splotchy area in Rob's diagram are issues that are live and trip us up continually. I suspect I could map fairly neatly many of the issues that pile up on my desk onto that fudging that allowed these incommensurable traditions to unite. It would not be the number one time taker. And that would be, I fear, the institutional implications of individual mental health issues. That would be a fascinating area for research, but well outside of anything I can do. At this point, I do want to reflect just a little further into the legal entities that sit alongside the United Reformed Church. Because believe it or not, Rom's diagrams are actually, as they would have to be to even exist, a considerable oversimplification. Alongside the authority and relationships embedded within our ecclesiastical polity, the in excess of 14 incorporated legal entities that sit alongside the General Assembly and the 13 synods make for a massively more complicated diagram still, in which the issues of relationship and authority become ever more complexified. The Act of Parliament was in many ways carefully crafted. It allowed matters of property to be handled with assurance. It amended the terms of the trusts that property was held upon to serve the purposes of the United Reformed Church, whilst not changing the hands in which that trusteeship sat. Whilst the benefit of hindsight is always handy, I'm afraid it's not possible to sit in the General Secretary's seat and not at the moment lament that some of the detail was not more carefully considered. Although, as Ron said to me yesterday, had they not fudged it, URC might never have come into being. Fudging it 50 years later, and in the context of profound numerical decline and a profound rise in the compliance culture in which we live, leaves us with complex issues. I would note that the basis and structure are in many ways exceedingly Presbyterian. There is a strong sense of subsidiarity, each council of the church having its own functions, which other councils may not intervene in the exercising of, and that obligation always to consult other councils before taking decisions that affect others. And this does give the church meeting and elders meeting very considerable autonomy over the worship, witness, service and evangelism of the local church. There's also a clear sense that the local church is the basic unit of the church, not a wider unit as might be in Presbyterianism, Methodism, Anglicanism, or many other polities. But the General Assembly has the right to amend the basis and structure with provisos for consultation built in and mechanisms whereby if more than a third of synods were to object, they would fall. Assembly is also the final arbiter of disputes in the life of the church. In the last year, I've got to know the barrister Ed Morgan QC rather well. He defended a complex employment case for us, which took over much of my life in the back end of last year. He's a devout Catholic and a Catholic canon lawyer who does considerable work in the space between church-state relations, not least in employment matters. He did a real double take when he realised that in the United Reformed Church's appeals process, not only can the Assembly rule that a lower council's decision was improper, it may also substitute its own decision for it, it being inserted into the minute book of the lower council. Apparently, Rome does not have such great power over bishops' conferences or dioceses. Rome may only rule a decision improper and cause a matter to be reconsidered. We need a conversation about what that does to liability, he said to me ominously. In contrast, the Act of Parliament is really rather congregationalist. No sale or alteration of a church building may happen other than under the direction of a local church meeting. A continuing church meeting always directs the proceeds of a sale. There is provision where the primary purpose of a building has failed for buildings to be disposed of, and then synods do direct the application of the proceeds, but during the life of a congregation, the congregation, are firmly in the driving seat over property matters. Yes, synods must consent, trustees act within their discretion, but they would struggle to use that discretion against the wishes of a congregation if those wishes were within the terms of the trust. what fascinates me is that in custom and practice, we have tended to operate the basis and structure in very congregationalist ways, and interpreted the Act of Parliament in very Presbyterian ways. So despite what Ron will say, I still maintain that the only council of the church that has the function to dissolve a local church is the synod. Previously it was the district council. The church meeting and elders meeting have no such function listed in the functions, and therefore no such authority within the structures of the United Reformed Church. One has to make a legal argument from first principles outside of the structure to defend a church dissolving itself under its own authority, which is simply that any voluntary association can, by definition, decide to no longer voluntarily associate. However, our custom and practice is that most synods would maintain that they do not have the authority to dissolve a church, and overwhelmingly local congregations believe the same. Now clearly and ideally, in the overwhelming majority of situations, one wishes a local congregation jointly with the synod to determine when they believe their mission to a particular place has come to an end. But what I find fascinating is the way our culture and custom and practice, and I suspect anecdote handed on from generation to generation, colour so strongly how we read our foundational texts, that what's plainly in black and white is simply at times not believed. On the flip side, the operation of the scheduled trusts by some synods and synod trusts has tended strongly in a Presbyterian direction. Some synods have made blanket determinations that they will only consent to the disposal of property if the church meeting is going to direct all the proceeds to the synod. Local churches lose a clearly intended function of determining how funds are to be directed from property held in trust primarily for their local purposes. Some synods have consistently used a paragraph of the scheduled trust to dispose of buildings with a continuing congregation that gives them the power to direct, clearly contrary to the Act. There are also built-in tensions within the structure in the Act. Property, again, comes to the fore. In very good Presbyterian fashion, the structure lists as one of the functions of the synod to decide upon all matters regarding erection, major reconstruction, or disposal of buildings. The structure has no such functions for local church meetings and elders meetings. They are responsible for repair and upkeep. But the Act is clear. Disposal, particularly where there is an ongoing congregation, puts the congregation firmly in the driving seat. They decide and ultimately authorise the disposal of a building. Synod may or may not consent. The trustees may use their discretion, but the authority comes from the church meeting. The structure and the Act clearly depart from one another. And often we read these texts through the lens of custom and practice and received wisdom. The court of law would read them as texts. We would be wise to begin to do the same for ourselves before someone decides to let a court of law read them for us. I want to raise another historical development that has significantly marked the life of the United Reformed Church, and that is changes to charity legislation, expectations of charity governance and compliance. Whilst our forebears might have had their civic liberties removed for the sake of their theological convictions in a bid to repress the tradition, the lived experience of many of our congregations is that what represses them to the point of extinction at times is charity governance, health and safety, safeguarding, insurance, risk assessments, and the like. And we find ourselves in a bind here, for we recognise all these things as common goods that we would wish to uphold. Most of them simply were not on the horizon at the date of the formation of the URC. The charities that support the work of the church were were exempted charities. And charity law was far more concerned with the protection of property than it was about governance. As charity legislation has unfolded throughout the 50-year life of the Church, safeguarding property and finances for the appropriate charitable purposes is now but one of a whole wide range of charitable governance responsibilities. The governance of the operation of the charity itself has become a much more significant aspect of the requirements on us. Structurally, this is perhaps at its neatest in the local church, where normally the eldership of the trustees of the local funds charity, which is uncomplicated by questions of trusteeship of property, which is normally held in a synod trust company. The picture becomes a little less clear at synod and general assembly level, where upon the registration of charities with a turnover of over 100,000, the decision was taken on advice from the Charity Commission that many would now question, that synod funds should be held charitably by synod trust companies, whose primary purpose when they were set up was to hold property for local churches. Something similar happened at General Assembly level too. Thereby, trust companies set up primarily to hold land and physical properties also became the charitable trustees in governance terms of the operations of the United Reformed Church. Many took this on without reconceiving of their role or their agendas. So confusion now frequently arises over the difference between the church and the charitable entities that hold the funds of the church, and who is responsible for what. Safeguarding is an interesting one, the URC Trust at the minute. Historically, it's not taken any interest in safeguarding, and yet it has to ensure legally that its funds are used in a way that is safe. But on the other hand, it itself doesn't have any real activity. All the activity is that of the church, but its funds are used to fund the activity of the church. We have yet, I think, properly to settle how the URC Trust oversees the correct use of its funds, whilst we appropriately maintain the autonomy of the governance of the church as a church. There would have been ways that could have been set up somewhat more easily. Anyway. None of this is perhaps terribly surprising, because no one could have conceived of the extent of the range of charity law 50 years ago. It's also perhaps not surprising, given that 50 years ago there was relatively little understanding, before the URC came into being, of the legal structures that might be required to support it after it came into existence. The Act of Parliament dissolved all the unincorporated associations, so the churchy bits. It was only recently when I was at the Congregational Assembly addressing them, I felt so keenly what that had done to surviving Congregationalism. All their structures of associations and relationships in Rom's diagram were simply by fiat from Act of Parliament taken from them. And that's quite remarkable, and the hurt clearly lives on. The Act of Parliament dissolved all the unincorporated associations, leaving myriad incorporated associations, trusts, holding land, property and the financial assets of congregations, now some of which were URC and some of which were not, in geographical units that did not map onto the structures of the URC. What followed was, by all anecdotal accounts I've heard, and I certainly haven't yet tried to trace this out in the paperwork, although that joy may yet await, it led to a good couple of decades, frankly, of chaotic and tortuous work. That was still going on when I first became an active member in my local church meeting in the 1990s, where I remember the church meeting where we moved the trusteeship of the property to the Northwestern Synod Trust. 72 to the early 90s to be unravelling all of this is quite something. It largely is now unravelled, barring some congregations that didn't quite wish to play ball, and most synod trusts do now hold the titles of all the church building and some matches for properties within the synod. The financial funds were divided between the United Reformed Church and other churches of the predecessor traditions according to proportions set out in a Charity Commission scheme, paperwork of which I don't seem to have been handed on. I'm not sure that anybody in that process noted that synods in the basis and structure are very clearly not immutable, but conceived of as having boundaries that can be relatively straightforwardly altered by the General Assembly. So what we've ended up with is a legal structure that sits behind the work of the Church that often feels immovable. And I think it is not insignificant in debates around the removal of district councils. I recall the bottom line argument amounting to the reality that the trust sat at synod level, and unpicking that to move to any other kind of single layer of intermediate governance was simply too much to face, which possibly in the very much living memory of those who'd spent 2 or 3 decades doing it, I have some understanding of. However, it does seem to me that it's rather odd that we are now allowing our legal structures to determine where the natural council of oversight of church life sits within the life of the church. It feels a little cart and horse, as it were. District councils certainly could not continue the way they were. I might have thought that they could, if the only district councils I've experienced had been Lancaster, Mid-Scotland or Cambridge, all of which I have been in, but I challenge anyone to have sat through a meeting of the Liverpool District Council and not to come away with a very firm desire to abolish them. I still remain unconvinced that allowing those legal structures to discern our natural councils of oversight was necessarily in the longer term helpful. That we ended up in a messy and complicated process with this kind of format has also come to define some of our decisions about where episcopacy does lay, where oversight does lay. And here we have some unintended consequences. Clearly oversight now lays primarily with the synods. But this, in the experience of synod moderators, some of whom were reflecting on this with me only very recently, has radically shifted the role of the synod moderator. Synod moderators were a member of the primary council of oversight, but they did not convene it. They have become the president of the council with final oversight. Most synods are of a size that make it impossible to debate the detailed work of grouping and scoping and deployment in any meaningful way other than by passing or rejecting a resolution on the floor of synod. And there is a sense that individual synod moderators feel the weight, personally, of many decisions that they would wish the church to experience as conciliar. Others, of course, might point at synod moderators and say they're power hungry. I think it's genuinely a lot more complex than that. So the determination of our structures by some of these legal boundaries has interestingly pushed us in a direction of greater personal episcopacy. We are perhaps less conciliar than we were. And so in the course of the URC's history, as David Peel has mapped for us, synods have grown from being largely a moderator and a typist to collectively employing, I would hazard from an educated guess, more people than who work at Church House in London. Much of their work ends up being about supporting local churches in charity governance and compliance work, assisting them with their finances and property, helping ensure that their safeguarding is appropriately supported and in place, and this is vital work. But I confess I remain far from convinced that an ecclesiastical council of oversight, whose functions are primarily of supporting, encouraging and overseeing the missional life of local congregations, or trust companies designed primarily for the purposes of holding charitable property, are the ideal vehicles to do this. I also question whether delivering this kind of support for local churches 13 times over in 13 different ways, often at a scale because of the size of some synods that makes it impossible to get the level of expertise ideally needed to do the job, is the best way of doing this. I labour this point somewhat because anecdotally, and I suspect fairly soon empirically, what we hear from congregations, elders and ministers time and time again is what they desperately need is support with these governance compliance issues, which were never conceived of as needing a home in our original structures. And we have found them ad hoc homes, rather than necessarily homes which best support the work that needs to be delivered. I began by reflecting on our tendency to a slightly docetic undervaluing of the physical. And I do sense that this was so amongst those who brought the United Reformed Church into being. A concentration on the faith and polity of the new church, along with a consideration of the terms of trusts on which property was held, but without a corresponding level of care as to questions around the legal entities that would be required to facilitate the new life of the church, led to an early couple of decades dominated in some places by trying to sort this out, and has left us with a set of structures it feels like constrain and at times control the life and polity of the church, rather than with ease facilitate and enable it. And that is before we consider whether a church vastly smaller in scale than at its inception, and set to become radically smaller again in the next couple of decades, can possibly support a weighty structure of 14 legal entities. Simply finding competent trust directors for synods and the General Assembly becomes harder and harder. And I would hazard that many we do have, some of whom have served off and on for decades, are nearer 80 than 70. A holidaying General Secretary a few weeks ago stumbled across the latest predictions of the demise of the United Reformed Church. John Haywards' mathematical model of church decline, based upon what we all now understand as an R number, something we never would have understood a couple of years ago, makes startling reading. The United Reformed Church gets its own special graph, demonstrating a plunging straight line from 1995, showing our extinction point to be 2038. That is before my retirement date. Haywards' mathematics, I don't doubt. He clearly does have a theological axe to grind that I would doubt. And I suspect if one asked questions about migration and whether churches were growing with new believers or by transfer from other traditions, one might find some of the theological analysis wanting. The maths, however, I confess, point to various things that I roughly do expect. The demography of the United Reformed Church is predominantly older. In fact, anecdotally, I might say from my trips around the URC, very old. We stopped collecting meaningful demographic statistics about 20 years ago, so we can't say for sure. Put very bluntly, by far and away the largest cohort of members of the United Reformed Church will reach the end of their lives in the next 10 years. I remember some time ago David pointing out that this moment might have come 15 years ago or so, but for the massive extension of life expectancy through the 20th and 21st centuries. The effect of this is that the percentage speed of decline will increase. So rather than a nice gentle curve showing our absolute numbers declining, gently levelling off, the line on the graph will continue to plunge. I disagree that we will be extinct by 2038, for reasons the Baptist theologian Steve Holmes has pointed out only yesterday in a blog post. You can tell what I was doing when I was supposed to be writing this, can't you? Hayward applies the R number to denominations as a whole, but it only really works with individual congregations. How infectious the faith is in an individual congregation might be measurable, but not all of our churches are declining at the same speed, or even declining. Some about hold their own. There is even an odd congregation that actually grows. Those who sustain that pattern will be alive and kicking well beyond 2038. And all one has to do is to look at URC youth to see that the whole URC is not going to be dead by 2038. Whether in many places it will be possible to covenant together in a local worshipping community of the United Reformed Church as the primary expression of one's membership of either the body of Christ or the United Reformed Church, I think is a rather open question. In some places that will be so, in others that will not be an option. Here I think we have an interesting ecumenical question. One perhaps we need to encourage our members to think about more intentionally than we do. Where and how do people work out their discipleship when worshipping in a local United Reformed Church is no longer possible? For some, they will simply move to another local church. When I've been ministering to closing churches, knowing where each member is in church the Sunday after closure has been a significant piece of pastoral ministry. But where we hear a growing clamour from younger people who feel deeply committed to the United Reformed Church and what it stands for, the clamour is for a way of being the United Reformed Church that doesn't require membership of a local congregation because there simply is not one where they are. Or also perhaps we need to see uncomfortably on many counts the 7 old dears and a cat that form the congregation, with worship led by a possibly unrecognised lay preacher who has been doing the rounds of nonconformist chapels in the area for at least the last 60 years, is not a place where they feel their discipleship can be fed. Of course, the possibilities of the ecumenical welcome make an interesting form of hybrid possible. People can become regular worshipping members of a local Church of England or Methodist church and still maintain some connection with the United Reformed Church. I hear of increasing numbers of people who use the daily devotion Sunday service that took off in such a way in the pandemic, just like this. It will be interesting to see, with dedicated ministry, whether any network-style dispersed community arises around this, making use of the possibilities of technology. And I also detect that URC Youth is now not far off functioning as some kind of dispersed, network-based ecclesial community that is the primary location for some of our young people where they work out their faith and their calling. And all of this presents a real challenge to our received understanding of church membership, and regularly over the years has led to steep intakes of breath in faith and order circles. I do have to question our theology of membership, however. Have we perhaps taken a powerful biblical metaphor and used it to justify modes of entry to church life, which were as much about upholding voluntarist convictions against the universal claims of a parochial Church of England than they were a really positive theological claim? Part of what seems to be happening, and I haven't had the chance to properly crunch the numbers, is that whereas church closures have consistently lagged behind the decline in membership, so on average more churches simply got smaller than closed, the rate of church closures now seems to be going up, and I would expect it will continue to do so. Churches do not close when they reach 0 members. They close when they can no longer find officers to fulfill the basic functions of church life, And that happens at surprisingly different sizes. And it is perhaps more about demography than actual size. My sense is that the combination of demography and size is going to see a pretty overwhelming number of closures in the next decade. In the last 12 months, at least between April last year and April this year when we do the counting, 44 have closed. At least that's what's being reported to the Assembly. There will doubtless be some that got away, but if that rate continued by 2030, it's just at 44, 352 will have closed. It would not surprise me if that was more like 600 ultimately. And I say all this not to be depressing, because actually I'm not entirely depressed by it. Even if some days as General Secretary it feels pretty overwhelming. When I responded to a call to ministry over 25 years ago, it was already clear what was happening to us. My generation of ministers significantly emerged into ministry fully expecting the church and ministry to be entirely unrecognisable by the time we retired, if indeed the United Reformed Church existed in anything like the form we knew it in by the time we retired. Even if Haywood is correct, and we will be extinct before I hit pensionable age, God will not be. I do not believe that God ever abandons God's people, the church, the body of Christ. The history of Israel suggests that God leads God's people into the wilderness at times. The history of the church globally suggests that the church rises and falls in different places at different times. And at the heart of our faith stands the cross and resurrection. The church is truly the body of Christ. Both death and resurrection are fully part of the life of the story of the church. Integral to our faith is the conviction that out of death emerges resurrection. There can be something profoundly exciting about that, as one thinks about this moment in the life of the church. It does not, however, make it an easy. But one of the counterparts to decline is what happens to our wealth. Say 400 churches do close before the end of the decade. And whilst it's hard to pluck a figure from the air to indicate the average value of a church building when it's sold, I know that Emmanuel Cambridge fetched £5.25 million, and I know some Welsh chapels you practically have to pay someone to take it off your hands. But let's say on average a church building is worth £400,000. No idea whether that would be so or not, but it's a figure. That's £160 million that will come in the next 8 years. Say those 400 churches between them have 100 manses that are solved. Let's say they're on average 300,000 apiece. That's another 30 million. In roughly the last 5 years, the combined wealth of the URC increased by about 50 million, and our wealth accumulation is going to speed up massively. We will be a very small church family, with a very large and unwieldy set of legal entities behind us, holding that wealth in 14 different pots of massively different sizes. Some of those legal entities are already creaking at the seams, and as I mentioned, finding trust directors becomes ever more difficult. And I do increasingly take the view that unless we can find some ways to radically simplify those legal structures, and there will be different ways of doing it, we will not be able to faithfully steward the very significant financial resource that is about to be released as the flip side of our decline. I do not underestimate the complexity of doing so, in part because of the very complex, not least to say haphazard way in which they were put together. With goodwill, a collaborative effort, and some significant action from the Charity Commission, I don't believe it would be beyond us. I do believe it will be entirely beyond us in 10 years' time. And I equally believe those structures will be beyond our capacity to make them work in 10 years' time. So what sort of church will we be in 20 years' time? There will be a few thriving United Reformed churches, some of which will be on the larger side, or larger in our terms anyway. Some of them will be those largely rural congregations that have simply always been small. They were 20 members 150 years ago, 20 members 50 years ago, are 20 members now, and probably will be 20 members in 50 years' time. Those churches that have been declining steadily for many years will largely no longer be with us, unless they take drastic action to renew their sense of vocation, catch a vision of the worship, witness, service and evangelism God is calling them to now, rather than that which served them 50 years ago. My observation is it often takes something quite drastic to happen for that to be the case. Sometimes it's an injection of new leadership, sometimes it's a church union, ecumenical or within the URC. Two congregations coming together can simply be tying together two sinking ships. But sometimes it really is the moment two congregations realise they are called to renew their life, recognise they will do that better together than apart, and also that they will often have the resources to do it together, but they will not apart, and new life emerges. I think some of the papers of this conference have pointed to things within our past that can offer us gifts for the future. We do have, I believe, in that creative tension of freedom, order and participation, a theological foundation for our worshipping life that enables us simultaneously to be creative and speak to the life of the world as it is today, whilst being firmly moored in Scripture and the tradition of the Church. Though it has to be said, the quality of our worship pains me at times. It is often, frankly, grim. Perhaps if I could be granted one wish, it would be that the people of the United Reformed Church would demand worship that touches hearts and minds, is effective emotionally, effective intellectually, engaged with the faith, and feels like a transformative encounter with the living God. I was struck by different things in our reflecting on Wales and Scotland. At this point, the General Secretary is supposed to reflect in heartfelt ways on being a church in three nations. However, what really stood out for me was the impact that one person's ministry had in Wales in the person of John Morgan's. We often, as a tradition, fight shy of recognising the gifts of the Spirit working in personal leadership, personal episcopal, one might say. There are moments it has been transformative within our life together, and there is something we might take from that. From Scotland, I was intrigued by the aspirations, which are in and of themselves fine aspirations. What I caught, though, was a sense of the way they have shaped the identity and work of the life of the Synod. Now, the Synod of Scotland is a very particular place, has a very particular identity with a different history to much of the rest of the URC. But what would it be, I wonder, for the United Reformed Church to have a set of aspirations that frame decisions it takes about what it does and does not do, and how it sets about doing it? The closest perhaps we've had was the Catch the Vision prayer, I think David probably penned, that for many, many years sat on my desk because I thought it encapsulated beautifully what we were about. Maybe we would do well to revisit it. I take from John and Karen's contribution, and similarly from Kirsty, both hope and challenge. At our best, we have fully grasped the implications of Paul's injunction that no form of human identity, be it biological, cultural or racial, Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, must ever be more defining for a Christian than our baptism into Christ. Our baptismal identity must always be Christ. And I don't now wish to unchurch the unbaptized within the life of the United Reformed Church. I would, however, still wish to uphold that baptism is the entry point to the life of the Church. Maybe doctrinal and pastoral reality diverge at that point, but never mind. The full radical implications of this, the Church is still working through. There are still cultural and structural issues that limit the place of women in the life of the Church that is magnified significantly for our black and ethnic minority colleagues, I fear. Which brings us back to David recalling for us Dodd's Unavowed Motives in Ecumenical Dialogue, which became known as non-theological factors, though that is a misnomer because they are profoundly theological. These unavowed motives are hugely strong within the life of churches. They are about the things which give us our individual and social identities, and we often will find a theological rationale for them after the event. This, in passing, is one thing that worries me about uncritical adoption of practical and pastoral theological methodologies. It can lead us to developing theological justifications for practices which, frankly, need to stand under judgment, not justification. Listening to Jean and to Romilly, it seems nothing less than miraculous in all kinds of ways that here the United Reformed Church is, 50 years on, significantly having moved through the tensions of all those unavowed motives that were so profoundly unsettled by union. I tend to agree with David that very significantly it is these unavowed motives that stop further ecumenical integration by way of organic unity. Theologically, I find it impossible to give up on a vision of full, visible, organic unity. Practically, I find that I work with the presumption that that quest has gone. These unavowed motives are powerful things. They are a product of our fallen human nature. Issues of power, money, class, status, place in society rule us considerably. I have heard elders and members in URC say, I would rather us close than unite with them. And if we united with them, they'd get access to our money. I have watched the prophecy come true. They have indeed closed. These unavowed motives or non-theological factors require close theological reflection. And I suspect the reason why Dodd's observation and a brief moment of reflection on it passed away because it simply comes in the category of too difficult. And yet, most of the New Testament epistles are concerned absolutely with matters that we might call non-theological factors. About how groups of people of different ethnic and cultural identities find it difficult to live together. Most of the epistles, one way and another, are precisely about trying to help those communities, those very broken communities that nonetheless are addressed as church. Understand that life in Christ through our baptismal identity is primary, and everything else must fall into place beyond it. It's difficult, it's tough, and the extent of the New Testament correspondence suggests those lessons were almost impossible to learn. Equally, if one addresses many of the issues that drive us apart, ecumenically and within the United Reformed Church itself, on the basis of issues of human identity, if one thinks about them doctrinally, they simply fall over. I find Willie James Jennings' book on the Christian imagination and the emergence of race profoundly telling. The end of each biographical account of a person, incident or moment that helps construct and bring into being the racist imagination within the Christian tradition, he locates one of the classical heresies. Non-theological factors are hard to address precisely because we stand so judged by them, because they require us to call out the very un-Christian nature of them. That is so ecumenically. That is so when we think about the place of minoritized groups within the life of the United Reformed Church. That is so when all change is resisted to maintain and uphold structures of power and control that can be as simple as the place of one dominant matriarch or patriarch within a congregation, or the question of who controls the money or the property. To address them requires us to admit that we are perhaps broken and in need of repair, as the New Testament churches were. Perhaps at its most extreme, if we follow Jennings, it requires us to admit we are heretics. But address them we must, if anything, of the ecumenical vision for full visible unity is to emerge, and if the United Reformed Church is to find ways of flourishing in the decades to come. Thank you.